His mother whispered, "She'll never afford to fly with us," a statement so casual yet heavy with condescension that it lingered in the air like an unspoken verdict. They were sitting in the first-class section, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and polished leather filling the small cabin. Her voice, soft but sharp, cut through the hum of the airplane's engines and the low murmur of flight attendants moving up and down the aisle. He glanced at his mother, unsure whether to nod in agreement or to challenge her, but the habitual caution he had learned over the years held him back. He had grown accustomed to her remarks, sharp as knives, carrying the weight of old prejudices and a sense of entitlement that seemed ingrained into her very being. Across the aisle, the girl existed in a different world entirely, one that seemed impervious to the judgments silently cast upon her. She was small, perhaps no older than 16, with dark hair tied neatly into a braid that fell gracefully over her shoulder. Her backpack was modest, worn at the edges, the faded fabric telling a story of countless journeys taken and adventures endured. She held a book in her hands, gripping it gently but with a sense of purpose, and her eyes were locked onto the pages as if the world around her did not exist. There was a serene focus in the way she read, a quiet intensity that contrasted sharply with the tension radiating from the first-class section. He noticed the subtle details, the way her fingers lingered on the paper, tracing lines and words as if memorizing them, the slight tilt of her head, the occasional frown of concentration. Her shoes were simple, scuffed at the toes, yet kept meticulously clean. The jacket she wore was practical, warm enough to keep her comfortable during the flight, but not one that drew attention or signaled wealth. It was clear she had not chosen to sit in first class, that she had paid for her seat honestly and with effort, yet the sheer audacity of her presence seemed to irritate them. His mother's eyes narrowed slightly as she caught sight of the girl, a flicker of disdain crossing her features. "She probably doesn't even know proper etiquette," she muttered under her breath, a habit of hers whenever she wanted to assert superiority over someone she deemed beneath her. He could hear the subtle sharpness in her tone, the way her words carried an unspoken hierarchy that ranked people by wealth and social status. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that the girl across from them seemed entirely unaware of the scrutiny, entirely unaffected by it, and for some reason, that struck a chord deep within him. The plane began its taxi down the runway, engines roaring to life, and the vibrations of power resonated through the cabin. Flight attendants moved with practiced grace, offering drinks and warm towels, their presence a gentle reminder of the service and attention that came with premium travel. The girl looked up briefly as the flight attendant passed, nodding politely and offering a soft, "Thank you," her manners simple yet sincere. There was no pretense, no attempt to show off wealth or status, just a quiet acknowledgement of human kindness. He watched her closely, noticing the faint smile she gave when the window seat passenger across from her tried to strike up a conversation. Her voice was soft when she responded, measured and careful, but there was an underlying confidence in the way she spoke, a subtle assertion of self-worth that required no validation from anyone else. She was entirely herself, a small island of authenticity in a sea of whispered judgments and invisible barriers. He glanced back at his mother, whose eyes had returned to the window, watching the city shrink beneath the wings of the plane. Her lips pursed slightly, as if in satisfaction with her own social ranking, and he felt a mix of frustration and pity. Frustration because he had always felt trapped by her rigid worldview, pity because he realized she could never see beyond it. Her comments were not born out of malice alone, but out of a lifetime of measured judgments, a carefully constructed lens through which she interpreted the world, one that discounted effort, intelligence, and character in favor of superficial markers of wealth and status. The girl adjusted her seat slightly, leaning back to find comfort in the cramped space. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and began jotting down notes, occasionally pausing to glance out the window at the clouds that stretched endlessly, billowing like soft mountains of white and gray. He noticed the way she seemed to absorb everything around her, the hum of the engines, the distant chatter of passengers, the subtle creaking of the overhead compartments, as though she were cataloging it all for future reflection. There was a patience in her demeanor, a resilience that seemed born of necessity, not privilege. He tried to imagine the girl's life outside this flight, piecing together fragments from her appearance and behavior. Perhaps she had to work hard for everything she had, saving every penny, studying diligently, and learning to navigate the world with a quiet, determined grace. Perhaps she had faced obstacles that his mother could never comprehend, moments of struggle that required more courage than sitting in first class ever would. He could feel a twinge of admiration, quickly suppressed by the lingering voice of his mother, reminding him to scoff, to judge, to see only what she wanted him to see. As the plane ascended, the city below fading into a blur of buildings and lights, he felt a strange duality. He was trapped in the social hierarchy dictated by his mother's words, yet simultaneously captivated by the girl's unspoken defiance of those very hierarchies. Her presence was a quiet rebellion, a reminder that dignity and grace could not be purchased or imposed, that some things remained untouched by wealth or privilege. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the flight, and the hum of conversation softened. He noticed how other passengers occasionally glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with subtle judgment, mirroring the disdain he had heard whispered from his own mother. Yet she remained unaffected, her focus unwavering, her world contained within the pages of her book and the small notebook where she recorded thoughts, observations, and perhaps dreams. He found himself studying her reactions to the small interactions that unfolded around her. When a fellow passenger accidentally dropped a pen, she picked it up without hesitation and handed it back with a gentle smile. When a child nearby cried out in frustration, she offered a calm word of reassurance, not out of obligation, but from an innate kindness that seemed effortless. Each gesture, small and unassuming, revealed a depth of character that first-class luxury could never buy. He felt a growing sense of shame as he compared her subtle acts of generosity and attention to detail with the casual dismissiveness of his mother. Her judgments, though quiet, carried a weight that sought to diminish, to belittle, to place the girl in a category that was less than. Yet the girl's actions, her calm demeanor, her unwavering focus, stood as a testament to the fact that worth was not determined by money or status, but by heart and character. Hours passed slowly, the flight stretching on, and he noticed how the girl navigated the cabin space with quiet confidence. She moved without drawing unnecessary attention, interacted without pretension, and carried herself with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the entitled airs of those around her. He began to realize that the true measure of a person's value was not in the luxury of their seat or the brand of their luggage, but in their ability to face the world with integrity, kindness, and resilience. He glanced at his mother again, noting the subtle tension in her posture, the faint furrow in her brow as she occasionally looked across at the girl. It was as if she sensed, on some unconscious level, that the world was larger and more complex than her rigid social hierarchies allowed. Perhaps that was why her comment had come so quickly, a preemptive strike to preserve her sense of superiority, to label the girl before she could inadvertently challenge it. The girl returned her attention to the book in her hands, her eyes scanning each page with careful precision. He imagined the stories contained within, worlds unknown, lessons learned, and journeys undertaken through imagination and intellect. She carried herself not with arrogance, but with quiet pride in her knowledge, her abilities, and her capacity to engage with the world on her own terms. He felt a subtle shift within himself, a stirring of admiration and curiosity, a desire to understand her perspective, her life, and the experiences that had shaped her. For the first time in a long while, he questioned the assumptions he had absorbed from his mother, the judgments he had taken for granted, and the narrow lens through which he had been taught to view the world. The hum of the engines, the soft dimming of the cabin lights, the occasional clink of service trays, all became background to the more important story unfolding in silence, a quiet confrontation between inherited prejudice and lived character, between casual dismissal and undeniable presence. He realized that the girl across the aisle was not just a passenger on the plane, but a mirror, reflecting both their judgments and their blind spots, challenging them in ways that required neither words nor confrontation. He continued to observe her, noticing the way she occasionally glanced around the cabin, taking in details, cataloging interactions, yet always returning to her book and her notebook. There was a balance in her focus, a harmony between awareness of the world and immersion in her own pursuits. He thought about the effort it must have taken for her to be here, to afford this flight, to carry herself with such quiet confidence despite the subtle hostility around her. He felt a quiet admiration growing, mingled with an awareness of his mother's limitations. Her whispered words, meant to belittle, now seemed hollow, almost pathetic in contrast to the girl's presence. He realized that the true journey of this flight was not measured in miles or altitude, but in the silent lessons being imparted by someone who had no intention of teaching, only of existing authentically. And as the plane leveled off, cruising above the clouds, he felt a profound shift within himself. The whispered judgment, the casual dismissal, the assumption of inferiority, all of it began to lose its weight. The girl across the aisle, with her book, her notebook, and her quiet dignity, had already made a lasting impression, one that would resonate far beyond the 12 hours of flight, far beyond the cramped confines of the cabin, into the broader expanse of understanding, empathy, and awareness that he had only just begun to explore. As the plane began to lift off the runway, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the low rumble of the engines vibrating through every seat, every passenger, every tiny object clinging to its spot in the overhead bins. There was a subtle shift in the energy around them, an almost imperceptible tension that settled like a heavy fog. He felt it immediately, the kind of tension that comes not from the mechanical ascent of an aircraft, but from the complicated interplay of human perception, assumptions, and expectations. The air seemed charged with the unspoken thoughts of the passengers, a mix of excitement, impatience, fatigue, and silent judgment, all weaving together into a complex emotional atmosphere. Across the aisle, the girl remained calm, almost serene, as if the very turbulence of the plane's movement had no effect on her inner world. Her hands rested on her notebook, a pen poised delicately between her fingers, but she had not yet resumed writing. Her eyes occasionally flicked up to glance out the window at the city below, catching the last glimmers of sunlight reflecting off the skyscrapers, the streets, the highways, all shrinking rapidly as the plane climbed higher into the sky. Each time she looked around the cabin, she did so with quiet observation, without judgment or reaction, simply noting the world as it presented itself, cataloging it perhaps in ways no one else could see. He could feel the weight of his mother's gaze on him, a constant reminder of the hierarchy she had always imposed. Her posture was rigid, almost as if she were bracing herself against the physical reality of being so close to someone she considered beneath her. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, kept flicking to the girl, and he could hear the quiet murmur of her whisper again, "Can you believe she's sitting here?" There was a tone in her voice, a mix of disbelief and condescension, as though the very act of the girl occupying a first-class seat was an affront to the natural order. The tension between them seemed almost tangible, a silent battle fought across the aisle with no words exchanged, only glances, postures, and the subtle cues of body language. He watched the girl's reaction, or rather, the lack of it, and felt a strange combination of admiration and relief. She seemed impervious to it, completely self-contained, as if she had spent her life navigating spaces filled with judgment and had learned the art of moving through them unscathed. Every time a passenger nearby sneezed, coughed, or shifted in their seat, she adjusted slightly but never in a way that drew attention. Every time the flight attendant passed by offering drinks or snacks, she responded with quiet politeness, her voice soft yet confident, never once betraying discomfort or irritation. He thought about how different this experience was for him, trapped in a constant feedback loop of expectation and observation, caught between his mother's assumptions and the undeniable presence of someone who refused to be defined by them. He could feel the subtle anxiety creeping in, the way his chest tightened slightly with each passing minute, the constant awareness of the girl's proximity, and the uncomfortable realization that the 12-hour flight ahead would force him and his mother into prolonged, unavoidable exposure to her being. The plane's engines roared steadily, the vibration through the floorboard almost hypnotic, as if emphasizing the relentless forward motion of not just the aircraft but of the next 12 hours. He glanced around the cabin, noticing other passengers settling in for the long haul. Some were reading, some were dozing off, some were scrolling through devices, headphones firmly in place, creating little personal islands of distraction. Yet the girl remained present in the moment, her awareness acute, her focus not on escape but on quiet observation, on maintaining her composure and dignity amidst a sea of subtle hostility. His mother shifted in her seat again, her body language tense, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped in her lap. There was a faint edge to her movements, a kind of restless vigilance that betrayed her discomfort. She glanced at him once, her eyes narrowing in that way that demanded silent complicity. "Don't let her disturb you," she said softly, but the words were unnecessary. The real message was conveyed in the set of her jaw and the sharp tilt of her head. She expected him to align with her judgment, to see the girl not as a fellow human being but as an interloper, an anomaly in the world they had carefully constructed for themselves. He noticed how the girl occasionally adjusted her seatbelt, the motion casual yet deliberate, a small sign of her autonomy and awareness. She shifted her weight slightly, leaning back into the seat to find comfort, and for a moment, her gaze lifted, meeting his across the aisle. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but in that moment, he felt a connection, a recognition that transcended the unspoken judgments around them. Her eyes did not carry arrogance or challenge, they carried a quiet intelligence, a kind of inner strength that made him question everything he had been taught to value in terms of wealth, status, and appearance. Time stretched slowly, the first few hours of the flight feeling almost suspended in a strange liminal space where every detail was heightened. He could hear the subtle creaks of the seats as passengers shifted, the occasional clatter of trays or dropped utensils, the soft murmur of conversations filtered through polite tones and whispered confidences. All of it seemed amplified by the tension, the unspoken awareness that for 12 hours, they would be sharing space with someone they had already decided did not belong. The girl opened her notebook at last, flipping to a clean page with precise movements. She began to write, not hurriedly, not distractedly, but with intention, each word forming carefully, thoughtfully. He couldn't see the words, but he imagined them as reflections of her life, her thoughts, her dreams, perhaps even her observations of the people around her. There was a rhythm to her writing, a meditative quality that contrasted starkly with the restless energy emanating from his mother. It was a small, intimate act of self-expression, yet it radiated a quiet defiance, a statement that she existed fully, unapologetically, and without the need for validation from anyone else. He felt the hours stretch onward, each minute a gentle test of patience and endurance. His mother continued her quiet criticisms, subtle murmurs under her breath, a constant reminder of the hierarchies she clung to. He could feel her frustration growing as she realized that her judgments had little to no impact on the girl's composure. Every attempt to cast doubt or infer inferiority seemed to bounce off an invisible shield of self-assurance. The girl's world was not defined by wealth or privilege but by her own values, her own resilience, and the quiet power of her presence. He watched as the cabin lights dimmed for a brief period of calm, the hum of the engines filling the space with a steady, reassuring background noise. The girl leaned forward slightly, her head resting lightly on her hand as she scribbled notes, her focus unbroken. He noticed the faint lines of concentration on her face, the slight tightening of her lips, the way her eyes flitted briefly to the window before returning to her work. There was an elegance in her attention to detail, a grace in her movements that spoke to a life lived with care, diligence, and perhaps a touch of hardship that had forged a quiet strength within her. By now, he could feel the subtle transformation happening within himself. The whispered judgments of his mother, the assumptions he had absorbed over the years, all began to feel hollow and unconvincing. He found himself paying more attention to the girl's composure, her resilience, and her quiet acts of observation and kindness than to the shallow measures of status and entitlement that had dominated his upbringing. Each glance, each small gesture, each unassuming act of presence carried a lesson in dignity and patience that he had never encountered before. Hours passed with the subtle rhythm of the flight, turbulence rising and falling, drinks served and cleared away, passengers dozing and waking, murmuring softly in the dim cabin. And throughout it all, the girl remained a constant, unflappable presence, a silent anchor of authenticity in the midst of subtle judgment and whispered assumptions. He noticed the way other passengers occasionally glanced at her, some with curiosity, some with judgment, some with mere indifference, yet none of it seemed to reach her core. She existed beyond the reach of petty opinions, defined only by her own sense of self and her quiet confidence. He felt a growing admiration for her, mingled with a sense of shame at the shallow judgments he had once held. The 12 hours ahead, once a source of apprehension, now seemed like an opportunity to witness, to reflect, and to perhaps understand a life that had clearly demanded resilience, patience, and self-reliance far beyond what he had ever known. The cramped cabin, the humming engines, the restless passengers, they all became part of a backdrop for a more profound story unfolding silently across the aisle. The girl's occasional glances up from her notebook, her quiet interactions with the flight attendants, her attentive observations of the cabin, all revealed a mastery of presence that could not be bought, borrowed, or inherited. It was earned, cultivated through experience, and reinforced by a self-respect that rendered the whispered assumptions of wealth and status utterly meaningless. He realized, slowly but unmistakably, that this flight was not about physical distance, but about a journey of understanding, empathy, and the subtle dismantling of prejudice. And as the hours continued to stretch, the hum of the engines and the gentle sway of the plane serving as a steady rhythm, he understood that for 12 long hours, they were not just physically trapped side by side in the cramped cabin, they were participants in a shared, unspoken lesson. The girl across the aisle, quietly reading, writing, and observing, was teaching without intent, existing fully without apology, and showing the quiet power of dignity and resilience in a world too often dominated by shallow judgments and assumptions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the girl began to reveal a depth of resilience that had been hidden beneath the quiet calm she had maintained since boarding the flight. At first, it was small gestures that went largely unnoticed by most passengers but that struck him with a quiet force. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small packet of snacks, neatly wrapped and modest in quantity, yet enough to share. With a gentle smile, she offered them to the child sitting across the aisle, a boy fidgeting nervously in his seat. His initial hesitation melted away as she extended the snack toward him, and he accepted it with wide-eyed gratitude. It was a small act, seemingly trivial, yet it carried a weight far greater than she realized. He watched her closely, marveling at the grace and natural ease with which she moved through the cabin. Unlike the entitled chatter and subtle judgments of his mother, her interactions carried authenticity. They were not performed for recognition, nor were they gestures of superiority, they were simply acts of human kindness. Each smile she offered, each word of encouragement, seemed to diffuse some of the tension that had hung heavy in the air since takeoff. Passengers who had been casting subtle glances now found themselves stealing moments to observe her quietly, unsure why they were drawn to her presence, yet unable to look away. The first sign of her impact came when an elderly woman in the row behind her dropped her reading glasses. Without hesitation, the girl bent slightly, retrieved them, and handed them back with a soft, "Here you go, ma'am." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, a faint smile spreading across her face, and she muttered a small thank you. What could have been a fleeting interaction became something more profound, a subtle recognition of kindness in a world that often overlooked it. He could see his mother's expression change slightly, her mouth tightening, a hint of unease creeping into her features as if she had just realized that the girl's presence was quietly undermining the assumptions she had so confidently made. He noticed the way the girl moved through the cabin with purposeful yet unassuming energy. She wasn't seeking attention, yet attention found her. When a passenger struggled to reach for a water bottle in the overhead bin, she leaned over and offered assistance without hesitation, her movements fluid and natural. There was no condescension, no expectation of reward, only the simple act of helping another human being. The subtlety of her actions began to shift the atmosphere around her, turning what had been judgment into curiosity, suspicion into reflection. The whispered remarks that had circulated early in the flight began to dissipate, replaced by an uneasy silence, a quiet acknowledgement that her presence carried a dignity that could not be diminished by money, status, or preconceived notions. He found himself reflecting on the layers of resilience this girl must have cultivated over her life. To sit calmly amidst whispers and subtle glances of disdain, to move with composure through an environment that had judged her before she had spoken, required more than just patience, it required strength. He imagined the countless moments in her past where she had been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked, and how she had learned to navigate such situations with quiet determination. Every small act she performed on this flight was a testament to her character, a reflection of resilience honed over time, and an assertion of self-worth that demanded no external validation. The flight continued, and the hours stretched on. He watched her offer a spare tissue to a nervous passenger whose child had begun to cry, her voice soft and reassuring as she said, "It's okay, don't worry. It will be fine." Her words carried a calm certainty that seemed to ripple through the immediate vicinity, easing tension, softening nerves, and transforming the cabin's energy in subtle, almost magical ways. He realized that for 12 hours they were not just coexisting physically, but witnessing the profound effect of one person's empathy, grace, and resilience on a confined, shared space. His mother, on the other hand, seemed increasingly unsettled. Her judgmental gaze no longer carried the certainty it had at the start of the flight. She muttered under her breath, her words barely audible, and he could sense the frustration and confusion building within her. The girl's composure and quiet acts of kindness were dismantling the rigid hierarchy of assumptions she had constructed in her mind. Her whispered dismissals now sounded hollow, inadequate, even foolish, in the face of the tangible proof of the girl's character. He observed how other passengers were drawn into her orbit. A business traveler across the aisle accepted a handwritten note she passed along, offering encouragement to the flight attendants, thanking them for their work, and sharing a small joke to lighten the atmosphere. Laughter, soft but genuine, emerged in pockets of the cabin, a rare and unexpected occurrence during a long flight. The girl did not seek to be the center of attention, yet she had become a catalyst for connection, empathy, and human warmth in a space that had begun as tense and judgmental. He could feel a subtle transformation taking place within himself as well. The assumptions and biases he had carried, inherited in part from his mother's worldview, began to crumble quietly. He started to see the girl not as an outsider or an object of comparison, but as a human being whose strength, resilience, and kindness transcended superficial measures of wealth, class, or status. Each action she took, each smile she offered, each small, thoughtful gesture was an unspoken lesson, slowly eroding the foundations of preconceived judgment he had never questioned before. Even mundane acts became powerful demonstrations of character. When a passenger accidentally spilled a drink, she offered napkins and assisted in cleaning up the mess, never condescending, never drawing attention to herself, simply ensuring that the situation was handled with care and respect. She engaged with people not as an obligation, but as a natural expression of empathy, a reflection of an internal compass that valued kindness over judgment. In contrast, the whispers and judgments from those around her seemed increasingly petty, almost childish, as the reality of her character became undeniable. The girl's resilience manifested not only in her kindness but in her unwavering sense of self. She did not seek validation from anyone around her, nor did she flinch in response to subtle judgments. When someone gave her a surprised or skeptical look, she simply smiled politely and returned to her own world, her notebook, or her thoughts. This quiet, confident autonomy was perhaps her most powerful trait, a shield forged from experience, intelligence, and a deep understanding of her own worth. He reflected on how much courage it must take to navigate life in this manner. To exist fully and authentically, unshaken by judgment or whispers, required more than bravery, it required a cultivated resilience that many spend their entire lives attempting to develop. Each act of kindness, each smile, each thoughtful interaction was layered with quiet strength, demonstrating that resilience is not loud or boastful, but patient, steady, and profoundly human. As the flight continued, he noticed the subtle ripple effects of her behavior. Passengers who had once glanced her way with thinly veiled judgment now engaged with her in small, meaningful ways. A mother nearby allowed her child to interact with the girl, who offered gentle guidance and patience as the child explored curiosity and asked questions. Other passengers exchanged appreciative looks, quietly acknowledging the way her demeanor had shifted the energy of the cabin. Even the flight attendants seemed to move with slightly lighter steps, smiling more freely, responding with warmth and gratitude to the small gestures the girl offered. Her resilience extended beyond individual acts. She seemed to understand, intuitively, the emotional atmosphere of the cabin. She noticed anxiety and tension without judgment, offering reassurance, sharing space, and providing attention in ways that transformed discomfort into calm. Each interaction was deliberate, thoughtful, and unassuming, a reflection of a deep empathy that was rare and powerful. He could see how effortlessly she had turned silent whispers of judgment into uneasy silence, not through confrontation, but through the quiet assertion of presence, character, and human decency. He began to understand that the 12 hours of the flight were not merely a test of patience, but an extended demonstration of the ways in which human behavior, kindness, and resilience can alter the dynamics of a space. The girl's influence, subtle yet undeniable, reminded him that the assumptions we carry about others are often flimsy, constructed on superficial measures, and easily dismantled by the evidence of character, empathy, and quiet strength. By the halfway point of the flight, the atmosphere had shifted markedly. The initial tension and judgment that had dominated the first hours had given way to a more reflective, observant silence. His mother's posture had softened slightly, her whispered remarks diminished, and he sensed a growing discomfort within her at the realization that her assumptions had been incorrect. The girl's resilience, expressed through patience, kindness, and quiet confidence, had begun to penetrate even the most rigidly held prejudices in the cabin. He continued to watch her, fascinated by the way she navigated social interactions with ease and thoughtfulness. When a passenger fumbled with headphones or an entertainment device, she offered guidance politely and without condescension. When someone dropped a magazine, she retrieved it and passed it back with a gentle word. Each small act, while seemingly minor, contributed to a growing sense of harmony in the cabin, a testament to the quiet power of resilience expressed through care, empathy, and attentiveness. Her resilience was not performative. She did not seek recognition, admiration, or reward. She acted because it was natural, because it aligned with her values, and because she possessed the internal strength to act from authenticity rather than obligation. Observing her, he realized that true resilience is measured not by dramatic displays of courage or heroism, but by the quiet, consistent choices we make to engage with the world thoughtfully, kindly, and with integrity. He could see the effect she had on the most subtle levels of perception. A passenger who had been visibly tense now relaxed slightly as she smiled and offered reassurance. A child who had been fidgeting found a moment of calm as she engaged patiently, answering questions and offering gentle guidance. Even those who remained judgmental seemed to shift their focus, distracted by the undeniable evidence of her character, their initial assumptions crumbling quietly in the face of lived reality. The girl's resilience and kindness acted as a kind of gentle corrective, a soft but unyielding force that altered the energy of the entire cabin. He realized that this was a rare quality, one that could not be taught or inherited, but had to be developed through experience, reflection, and a conscious choice to act with integrity and empathy. She had created a space in which human dignity and connection could flourish, simply by existing authentically, consistently, and compassionately. And as the flight continued, the 12 hours stretched forward, yet felt lighter, transformed by the girl's presence. The whispered judgments that had once defined the atmosphere were replaced by a growing awareness, a silent acknowledgement of resilience, kindness, and strength that could not be dismissed or diminished. The girl's impact was subtle, pervasive, and enduring, leaving an imprint on everyone within her sphere, challenging assumptions, and demonstrating the quiet power of human dignity in a way that no amount of wealth or status could ever replicate. By the time the plane began its descent, the weight of the 12-hour journey had shifted in subtle but profound ways. The cabin, which had once been a silent arena of judgment and quiet tension, had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. What had begun as an unspoken battle of assumptions, where a girl's presence challenged the carefully constructed hierarchy of privilege, had evolved into a collective acknowledgement of her quiet strength. Passengers who had initially glanced at her with skepticism or mild disdain now found themselves observing her with a mix of awe, respect, and a dawning sense of humility. Her presence, previously dismissed and underestimated, had made its mark, gently dismantling the invisible barriers that had separated her from the world around her. He watched the girl as she leaned slightly forward in her seat, her notebook resting on her lap, pen poised but still for a moment as she looked around the cabin. She was quiet, composed, and entirely herself, yet the aura she exuded had changed the energy of the plane in ways that were almost imperceptible but undeniably present. Passengers who had been restless, anxious, or even judgmental were now calmer, more attentive, and more considerate. Her small gestures, her kind words, her effortless empathy, each act had contributed to a subtle but pervasive transformation in the social atmosphere of the flight. He reflected on the journey they had shared, albeit indirectly, and realized that it was more than a physical passage through the sky. It had been a journey of perspective, of observation, and ultimately, of understanding. 12 hours of close proximity had allowed everyone to see beyond the superficial, beyond assumptions, beyond the narrow lens of judgment that so often distorts perception. The girl had revealed not just her resilience and kindness, but the kind of courage that cannot be measured in monetary terms or societal status. Her courage was quiet, steady, and profoundly human, and it had left an impression that would linger far beyond the confines of the cabin. He glanced at his mother, noting the subtle changes in her expression. Her posture, once rigid and dismissive, had softened slightly, though traces of lingering defensiveness remained. Her whispered judgments had faded into silence, replaced by a quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgement of the reality she had initially refused to see. It was clear, even to him, that she was processing the undeniable truth, that the girl across the aisle had demonstrated qualities of character, compassion, and courage that could never be purchased, taught, or inherited. Her presence had exposed the fragility of assumptions based on wealth and appearance, revealing the deeper, more enduring measures of human value. The girl herself seemed unaware of the impact she had made. She returned to her notebook, writing with the same deliberate care she had shown throughout the flight, occasionally glancing up to observe the sky beyond the window. There was a serenity in her demeanor, a quiet assurance that radiated from within, and it was precisely this quality that had altered the atmosphere of the cabin. She had existed authentically, acted with kindness, and maintained her dignity despite subtle prejudice and whispered assumptions, and in doing so, she had taught everyone around her a lesson in empathy and humanity. He thought about the moments when she had interacted with other passengers, the child she had offered snacks to, the elderly woman whose glasses she had returned, the nervous passenger she had reassured, the spilled drinks she had helped clean up. Each act, seemingly small, had carried immense weight, subtly challenging preconceived notions and revealing the true measure of strength and courage. It was not the grandeur of heroism, nor the overt display of bravery that defined her, but the quiet, consistent choices she made to act with integrity, compassion, and awareness. He reflected on his own internal transformation over the course of the flight. The judgments he had absorbed from his mother, the casual assumptions he had once taken for granted, had gradually unraveled in the face of the girl's undeniable character. Observing her, witnessing her resilience and kindness, he had come to understand that true value and strength are often invisible to the eye, imperceptible to those who measure worth in superficial terms. It was a lesson in humility, empathy, and perspective that he knew would remain with him long after the plane had touched down. The other passengers were also affected, though in subtler ways. Some avoided eye contact with her at first, unsure how to reconcile their initial assumptions with the reality of her demeanor. Others, who had been critical or dismissive, found themselves involuntarily drawn into small moments of interaction or observation, unable to ignore the quiet authority of her presence. By the time the flight attendants moved through the cabin preparing for landing, there was a noticeable shift, a sense of collective reflection, a quiet awareness that the experience had been more than just a flight. The girl had transformed the social environment of the cabin, not through force, argument, or confrontation, but through the enduring power of kindness, empathy, and personal integrity. As the plane descended toward the runway, the sun casting long, golden beams through the windows, he felt a profound sense of closure. The journey had begun with whispered judgments, casual assumptions, and subtle condescension, Yet it was ending with reflection, humility, and recognition of the deeper truths of human character. He realized that the girl had not sought validation or attention, she had simply lived authentically, demonstrating through action the strength, courage, and resilience that money, status, and entitlement could never replicate. He observed the expressions of the passengers around him. Many were quiet, thoughtful, perhaps replaying moments of interaction they had witnessed, recognizing in retrospect the significance of the girl's presence. Some had their heads bowed slightly, deep in contemplation. Others exchanged glances, in spoken acknowledgement passing between them, a mutual recognition that they had been subtly changed by the example she had set. The whispered assumptions, the initial judgments, had been rendered obsolete, replaced by a newfound respect and understanding that transcended superficial measures of value. His mother sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the window. The tension that had characterized her posture throughout the flight had eased slightly, though traces of regret lingered in her eyes. She had witnessed firsthand the limitations of her assumptions, the fragility of judgments based solely on appearances, and the profound impact of one individual's authentic presence. Though she might not fully articulate it, the lesson had been absorbed, subtly altering her perspective and reshaping the lens through which she would view others in the future. The girl finally looked up from her notebook, her gaze sweeping across the cabin with a quiet, inclusive awareness. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, not in challenge or confrontation, but in the calm acknowledgement of shared humanity. He felt a surge of admiration, a recognition of the profound courage it had taken for her to maintain such composure and integrity in the face of subtle judgment and exclusion. Her strength was not loud or boastful, it was steady, enduring, and deeply affecting, leaving an indelible impression on everyone within the cabin. He reflected on the nature of courage itself. It was easy to celebrate acts of heroism that were visible, dramatic, or widely recognized. Yet the courage he had witnessed on this flight was quieter, more nuanced, and ultimately more powerful. It lay in the ability to maintain dignity under scrutiny, to act with kindness in a space filled with judgment, and to influence others not through authority or entitlement, but through authenticity, empathy, and resilience. It was a form of strength that could not be purchased or taught, only cultivated through experience, reflection, and deliberate choice. As the landing gear extended and the plane prepared for its descent, he noticed the subtle interplay of emotions in the cabin. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some exchanging soft smiles or nods of acknowledgement, others lost in thought. The energy was no longer tense or judgmental, it was reflective, respectful, and quietly grateful. The girl's presence had shifted the atmosphere from one of silent exclusion to one of shared humanity, demonstrating that the true measure of value is found not in wealth, status, or privilege, but in the choices we make and the way we treat others. He thought back to the beginning of the flight, to his mother's whispered judgment and the assumptions that had framed the first hours. The contrast could not have been more stark. What had begun as a scenario dominated by bias and expectation had evolved into a lesson in empathy, humility, and perspective. The girl had shown that strength, courage, and kindness are not determined by social standing, but by character, resilience, and the capacity to act with integrity. He glanced at his mother one final time before the plane touched down. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sigh of realization escaping her lips, a subtle acknowledgement of the lesson she had been forced to witness. Her earlier certainty had crumbled under the weight of lived experience, replaced by an awareness of her own limitations and the enduring power of authentic human character. Though she might not speak it aloud, the transformation was visible in her posture, her expression, and the quiet energy she now projected. As the wheels of the plane touched the runway, the cabin was filled with the muted sounds of landing, the thrum of engines, the subtle vibration through the seats, the occasional announcement from the pilot. Yet beneath these ordinary sounds was a profound shift in consciousness, an invisible acknowledgement of the journey that had taken place beyond the physical distance traveled. The girl had not only traversed the skies but had traversed the landscape of human perception, challenging assumptions, inspiring reflection, and leaving a lasting impact that extended far beyond the cabin walls. The plane taxied toward the gate, and passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. He noticed the girl standing with quiet composure, her backpack slung neatly over one shoulder, her notebook tucked safely inside. She moved with a calm assurance, aware of the world around her but unburdened by it, carrying herself with a dignity that spoke volumes. Her presence had been transformative, a testament to the enduring strength of character, kindness, and resilience in a world too often dominated by superficial measures of worth. He reflected on the lessons of the flight, the subtle but powerful ways in which the girl had challenged assumptions and reshaped perceptions. The whispered judgments, the initial skepticism, and the quiet condescension had all been rendered obsolete in the face of her authenticity. She had demonstrated that true courage and value are measured not by wealth or status but by the capacity to act with integrity, empathy, and unwavering dignity, leaving an indelible mark on those fortunate enough to witness it. And as the cabin doors opened and the passengers began to file out, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and reflection. The girl had been a teacher without intent, a force of quiet resilience and compassion that had transformed the 12-hour flight into a profound lesson in humanity. By the time the plane had emptied, it was clear that the judgments once held were not only wrong, but insignificant in comparison to the enduring power of character, kindness, and courage that she had embodied so effortlessly.